Okay, so we've gone through 3 episodes of setup, and here's what we're getting towards at the culmination of all that work putting it together. We have this GitHub issue that is part of our repository. We want to capture a shipping address on an order. Various details of here, including what's required, what the acceptance criteria are, and so on and so forth. And let's go over to our AI agent, and we'll give it the command implement issue number 1. That's it. That's the whole prompt. So I'm going to take my hands off the keyboard and let the agent work. So the agent will go through, it'll read the issue, it'll create branches, it'll inspect the database, it'll write the feature, it'll create the tests, and it'll open the pull requests. And in the end, it'll stop and wait for me. I'm Barrett with NimblePros, and this is the capstone of the previous 3 episodes. So we'll let it work here for a moment. Might come back with a couple of questions. All right, so it's giving us the plan here. It says I'm going to create a branch. I'm going to look at the use case skills. I'm going to inspect the schema before naming any properties. I'm going to add a record to the database code piece and extend the place order command handler. And I'm going to write some unit tests and make sure that those tests all run. And all that before I do the commit and the draft PR. And once it gets to the PR, it'll stop and wait for me to give my feedback. So it's saying, hey, should I go ahead? And we're going to say yes. And we're going to go ahead and let it work. And while it does, let's jump over and take a look at some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So we're talking about agent-driven workflows. This is, the combination of all the previous efforts, everything coming together into one piece that lets us create a full workflow for our agent. So let's do a quick recap of where we've gotten to this point. With episode 1, we talked about the agent files, the instructions that we give to our agent to tell it the rules, the standards that it's going to work by and live by. With episode 2, we looked at skills, and those are our playbooks. These are providing more detailed instructions on how to carry out individual tasks. How to scaffold a piece of our application, how to do this, how to do that. With episode 3, we provided the ability for our AI agent to reach into our system, to look at our SQL schema database, to look at our Git repos and GitHub, to look at our file system, so on and so forth, using MCP servers. And then this is the part where it all comes together. This is the 4th layer. Each of those was useful alone, but as you were working with each of those individual pieces, you were still following the process of one prompt, and one task, and just repeating that over and over again. You, as the developer, as the human, were the orchestrator. Well, with the 4th layer here, with workflows, we're kind of flipping that around, and we're making the agent the orchestrator. We're providing a description of the outcome, and we're asking the agent to work out the steps using the instructions that it's been given in order to carry out that task and to accomplish it. So what is an agent-driven workflow? This is the place where, or this is defining how the agent will plan, execute, and verify a multi-step task all on its own. The difference from normal prompting is who's the person that owns the steps. In a prompt response, everything that we've done up to this point, we as the human developer own those steps. In a workflow, the agent is the one that owns those steps. It works through the whole flow, and then it circles back when it's done. And when a step runs sideways, it adapts mid-run instead of stopping dead. It tries to figure out what the solution is. And sometimes it may need feedback from you. But most of the time it's able to figure out what it is that it's trying to accomplish. And there are 4 keys to that in creating a successful and workable workflow. The first one is it has to be goal-oriented. We have to describe what the final output is instead of describing the individual steps or describing one step at a time. It needs to be a multi-step process. We need to lay out for the agent, what are the steps to get you from here to here. from here to there. And it needs to be self-verifying. The agent needs to be provided instructions on how to verify that it has completed that task. And then it needs to be tool using. It draws on everything that we've been doing through the first 3 episodes. It needs to have those instructions, it needs to have those skills, and it needs to have access to the MCP servers. Well, if you miss any of those pieces, you really don't have a workflow. You just have a prompt wearing a trench coat. Each of the layers of what we're working with has its own job. If you were to divide up the pieces of the labor together, we have instructions which define the rules that the agent follows through. You have the skills which provide the playbook for each of those steps. You have the MCP servers that give it the tools that it needs to reach out and execute and verify things. And then you have the culmination of the whole series, the workflows. All 3 of those steps are required. Without the standards, without the standards, the output drifts. Without the playbook, it improvises each step, and it might come up with a completely different solution each time you ask it. Without the tools, it can't touch your GitHub repos or your database or all these other pieces that it needs in order to be able to do its job correctly and completely. Well, workflows are what you get when all these 3 pieces are put together into a single process. It's not really a 4th thing that you bolt on to this. It's the emergent result. It's the as I say, the culmination of all the other layers put together. With the demo that we're launching there, I just give that instruction, implement this particular issue. It's a single line, and then the agent from that follows the guidance and directions that has been given on how to carry out that workflow. In this particular case, it does this process where it will fetch the issue from the GitHub. It will, look at the details of that issue. It will come up with a plan in order to implement that particular issue. It will confirm that plan with me because I gave it the instruction to stop and verify the plan before proceeding. Once I verify that that's what I want it to do, that the plan looks good, then it will build out the code base in order to implement that feature. It'll go through, designing the code, writing it all out, putting it all together, and then it will do the verification steps. In this particular case, it's doing a build and test. .NET build, .NET test in order to verify that everything builds correctly and that there aren't any bugs or errors. And that all the unit tests that it has put together are correct. When it has a successful build and test, then it will do a draft PR. And at that point, it's going to stop because that was the instruction that I gave to it. And I'll show you the whole workflow, that instruction that I've put together here in just a minute. But this is the process that's going to go through for this particular workflow for implementing a GitHub issue. So here is the actual workflow instructions that were given. So first we've got read the issue via GitHub MCP. So it uses that MCP tool to access your GitHub repo. It will pull down that issue. It'll look at what the information is that the issue. It looks at the attachments. It looks at the comments. It looks at everything that's a part of that. It will summarize what it understands the task to be, and confirm with me as the developer. Is this the correct understanding? Is this the process? Is this what I need to do? It will create a feature branch via the GitHub MCP. So again, making use of those tools that we've provided to it. If a new module is needed, then it's going to use the instructions for scaffolding a module. That's one of the skills that are in there. It will inspect the live schema in the database, again, using another MCP server tool that we've given it, that gives it the ability to access that SQL Server that's running here on my machine. And then it will go through the implementation of that feature. It'll say, okay, I've got the information that I need to design this. I know how to name things based on the database schema, and it will go ahead and implement that code based on the architecture that was laid out. For number 7, it's going to write those unit tests. So, we're not doing test-driven development in this particular case. If I wanted that, to be test-driven development, I would probably flip that up to, step 5 would probably be, or step 6 actually, I'd probably just flip those two, and it will do the test-driven development. Then with 8 and 9, it's doing the build and test, and if everything is is okay. It's gonna fix any issues or errors before it goes on to any further steps. Once all that is good and everything builds and tests correctly, then it's going to commit that with a message referencing the GitHub issue number, and it's going to open a draft pull request. Again, using that GitHub MCP tool, and then it's going to stop and it's going to summarize what it did and wait for me to go on from there. So these workflows that you write, they go into your instructions file, whether it be agents.md or claw.md or whatever instructions file that you're doing. This workflows will just be another section in there, just like we put in skills, just like we put in MCP servers, and giving it the instructions and references that it needs to get access to all of that. And we'll look at the full agent file here in a minute when we start looking at the actual full code base. But that's really how you lay out those workflows. You create another section in that instructions file. You put in these workflows saying, okay, in order to, if I'm given a GitHub issue number, this is the steps that I want you to go through, the complete workflow, in order to carry out the implementation of that. And, that's really how easy it is to implement a workflow for your agent. And then that's taking a lot of the work and the effort off of your hands and putting it into the hands of the AI agent. And that's really, like I say, that's the culmination. That's the summation of all these pieces that we've been working towards up to this point. But not only that, but we also have to give it some guardrails to keep it in line. Again, AI agents go off the rails all the time. If you don't provide specific and detailed instructions, the AI agent may go off and do all kinds of different things, or it might do a completely different process each time that you tell it to do that. If you don't provide those specific instructions and details, each time I tell it to implement an issue from my repo, it might come up with a completely different process to implement that. It's not saying it'll be wrong, but it's not going to be consistent, and it may come up with something completely different than what you were wanting or expecting. So, the way that we do that is we put in those guardrails. So step 2, confirm. Before you do anything, make sure that you get my verification that you understand what it is that it needs to be accomplished. Give me a plan, let me approve it before you actually do anything. And then once everything is done, stop. Don't go on to the next issue. Don't go on to something else. And this stop instruction is very useful for preventing runaway agents, because sometimes you give an agent an instruction and it might just keep going and going and going and never stop. It'll say, okay, I did this. Oh, well, now I need to do this. Well, now I need to do this. And it just keeps going. But if you give it, these guardrails to keep it in line, you're going to get more consistent and more effective results. And really, that's the whole point of the thing. So there are, I've found a number of issues or a number of workflows that are really useful to implement. One of them is the one that I've just been demonstrating here, this feature implementation. Most of us, as we're working on projects, work from various features. We're given a task, we're given an instruction to implement, and we go through these same steps over and over and over again. And that's where these workflows are really useful, is for implementing these repetitive processes that we have in place, these multi-step processes that we do on a daily basis or weekly basis, things that we can hand off to the AI agent, but we need to give it those instructions on how to carry out those repetitive tasks. Another one is a pull request review, PR review. That's a very common workflow process to put in place. How do you go about carrying out a workflow or carrying out a PR review? So you create a workflow around that, saying, okay, look at the diffs, look at the conventions, validate the migrations, look at the comments, never auto approve it, and never try to fix the bugs. Because when I ask an AI agent to do a PR review on something that I've done, or occasionally I'll use it for work as well, I want it to give me a summary of what it found. I don't want it to try to fix what somebody else has done. I don't want it to try to correct anything. I just want it to give an opinion, the same as I would any other developer. If I ask another developer to do a review of somebody's PR, I don't want them to try to fix what that person has done. I just want them to give a summary. Here's the things that I think could be improved. Here's the things, here's the bugs that I found. Here's the things that I think were good, all that kind of stuff. And so I lay out a workflow for following that process to give me those kinds of things. Say, okay, here are the things that we think are bugs. Here are the things that we think are good. And that's the kind of things that I want those reviews to do. So creating a workflow around that is something that I found to be very useful and helpful. Dependency audit. How often do libraries get updated, packages get updated? It's constant. And being able to create a dependency audit workflow, and having it look for those updates. Look at our NuGet packages. Flag anything that's outdated or banned. Flag anything with severe concerns, that kind of stuff. And if you find anything, create a ticket. Don't automatically update it. Create a ticket. And then somebody else will look at that and say, okay, is this something we need to do now? Is this something we need to do later? And especially given a lot of these 0-day injections that have been going into a lot of packages lately. You're constantly hearing stories about severe issues, with compromised packages and libraries. Well, you don't want, it's great to know that there's a new version of a library, but you don't necessarily want to implement it immediately. Especially given the prevalence of 0-day injections lately. You want to be aware that there's a new version, and to do that, but you don't want it to be automatically updated. So one of these things that I've put together is a workflow where I have a daily process that goes through all of my projects in a particular folder, and it says, okay, review all these for new libraries and new packages, and let me know what the new version is. Give me a summary of if there's like a README that gives you a summary of what the updates are. Give me a summary of that, and tell me how long it's been since that was released. That for me is the key thing, is to put that in place and have that workflow so that it's looking at that and saying, okay, this version of the library has now been out for a month. It's probably okay to go ahead and implement it at this point. And then, I can give feedback saying, okay, go ahead and update this one and this one and this one based on that. And then, do a build and test to make sure that doesn't break anything, all that kind of stuff. So those are part of, the workflows that I've found to be useful and helpful. So if there's anything else that you take away from this episode, it's this. You want a workflow to be implemented in such a way that you describe the outcome and not the steps. The steps are described in the workflow. You shouldn't have to tell the AI agent what those steps are. You want to describe the outcome and have it figure out from that, hey, this workflow applies to this description of an outcome. And here's the steps, that have been designed to implement that. So that's one of the very useful things that, or one of the keys to understand from this whole thing, is that the whole point of workflows is being able to describe that outcome and have the agent know what the steps are to get you there. So that's, like I say, if there's nothing else that you take from this, take that. Some other things that you can do to help keep it on the rails, keep things reliable, define explicit exit conditions and check-in points. I mentioned in the previous slide those 2 stopping points. Stop and verify that you understand first, and then once you've done implementing it and it's successful and you've created that PR, stop again. Don't go on to anything else. So make sure that you have those explicitly defined in the workflow. What are those stopping points? What are those stopping conditions? You also want to make sure that everything always stopping with a successful build and test. That takes time, and it can be a pain to sit and wait for it to complete that, but it's also make sure that everything's still working correctly, that what it implemented doesn't break all of your code and your application. You want to keep things scoped narrowly, keep them well defined, little bits at a time. You don't want it to go off and write entire applications based on a workflow. You want to do, individual features, keep those features small, keep them scoped small and well defined. And you want to have those checkpoints again. There are also times when you will be aware of places where things might commonly fail. And you can put in instructions in there, say, okay, if this particular step is not successful, then do this and this to try to recover. So you can put in those failure workflows, or those failure guidances as part of that workflow. Say, okay, when things don't work well, or something fails, maybe it's, part of it is you want to create a table in a database or something like that, or add records to a database table, whatever it might be. Something, especially an external thing where it has to go out and reach out and do something. If it can't do that, what should it do? Should it stop and report? Should it try to take a different approach for doing it? Like I say, there are times when things will commonly break, and if you can provide instructions to help it self-recover, then it's going to save yourself time and effort. But those are helpful things to include in there. So again, certain things that you shouldn't do: don't micromanage, don't skip the build and test, don't leave things wide open, don't keep them vague in general. And like everything else with AI agents, these should be considered living, breathing documents. They should be like your code. They should be revisited frequently. At least every 6 months, you should do a review of your workflows, like all the other markdown documents that you would create for your agents. You need to do regular reviews in order to make sure that it still fits your needs, that it's still doing what it is that you're expecting it to do. Because this is technology; things change frequently, and you need to keep up and make sure that your instructions are keeping up as well. All right, so let's jump over and look at the code, and let's see what the process is on the agent here. Let's see how successful it has done. All right, so let's go back up here. So you can see it's written the code here, and let's go back up here. Okay, done. So it's stopped here per that instruction. Once it was done, it reached that stopping point. It implemented issue number 1. Here's the description of that. Here is a link to the draft PR and the name of the feature branch and the commit and everything else that's related to that. Gives you a summary of the things that were changed. So it created some files. It did these tests, added these tests as well. The build was successful with 0 warnings and 0 errors, and it created 23 unit tests, which all pass. So there may be things that it needs to point out to you. So deviations. So neither the GitHub. Okay, so it's saying that the GitHub it wasn't able to do that, but it was able to use the GitHub CLI for the GitHub pieces. For the schema, it looked at the file, so it wasn't able to do that. I might not have started up the SQL Server. Let me look over here. Oh, yeah, I did not start the SQL Server container, so it wasn't able to connect to the SQL Server, but it inferred from the SQL schema. So that might, that's a good example of something where I might want to have put some detail into the workflow that said, okay, if you can't connect to SQL Server, stop and report and call that out, kind of thing. But in this particular case, it found an issue, and because I hadn't given any instructions to the contrary, it came up with a workaround. Said, okay, I can't see what the schema is, but I do see a SQL file that defines what the schema was, what the schema should be for the database. So I inferred from that what the schema of the database is. So it didn't, introduce any new schema changes based on the information that it found, and it did not do the merge, and it did not create any further issues. And then it gives you this little simple recap here at the bottom. So you can see it got all the way through the workflow. It got all the various pieces in place. And this is the result of completing that workflow. It did as it was instructed. So let's look at the full code of the application here. Zoom in a bit. All right, so let's start with the instructions file, since that's already open here. So you can see I've got, things very similar to the instructions files from previous episodes. I've got my architecture section, coding conventions, testing, things to never do. I've got references to the skills that are available. If we were to go over here and look in our Claude, we would see that those 3 skills are detailed in the files, the skill.markdown file that for each of those, and see that those are in place. And I've given it instructions on the available tools, my MCP servers. So those are in place as well. And then here's my workflow section. Here's that workflow that I created. So here were steps 1 through 12. Again, summarize and confirm with me before writing any code. And then at the very end, stop and summarize what was done. Do not go on to the next issue. Here's put in a simplified version of the PR review here. Workflow that I mentioned on that other slide. Here, it's just fetch the diff, check it against conventions in this file, post the findings as review comments, do not approve or merge, kind of thing. So you can see each of the workflows is the same way. It's a numbered list of steps, and the AI agent, when it determines that it needs to use one of those workflows per the instructions that you gave it, will go down through those steps one at a time. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, until it gets to the end and it implements what it is that you instructed it to implement. Really, like everything else, it's easy to implement these things. Like the instructions, like the skills, like the MCP tools. These are all very easy and easy things to implement into your code or into your agent workflow or agent processes. That's how we can take all of this and kind of pile it together. We take these steps that we've been building on with the previous 3 episodes of this series, and we look at that and we say, okay, we've given it the instructions. We've given it the skills to carry out individual tasks in a more detailed process. We've given it these MCP tools that it can use to reach out and to do various things. And having all of these in place, we can tie them all together using these workflows so that it can do these complex processes and is able to implement and carry out each of those. So a couple of last things to go through before we wrap up here. So just our takeaways, we've got these layers, instructions, skills, the MCP files, MCP servers, and we can layer them together to get this workflow outcome. And we're able to coalesce all these individual processes into a complex flow that it's able to use to carry out these tasks so that it can be more effective and more efficient. And we need to make sure that we have those guardrails in there. Those 2 lines that we added. First, the stop and summarize your understanding before you do anything, and then once you are done, stop again and summarize and report back. And also, make sure that you understand these are living documents. Keep them updated. Review them regularly. Don't just create them and walk away. These aren't SharePoint documents. These should be considered part of your code and part of your normal daily routine. So that's it. We have one more episode in this series that we're going to be doing here, and we're going to be talking about multi-agent teams and how to take these processes that we've been working through with an individual agent and kind of apply them to a multi-agent implementation so that they are able to work together as teams of developers, so to speak. But this is the foundation up to this point. We've got all these processes in place, and we're able to make them work together and give us the full stack of AI agent development. So that's it for this episode, and thank you for your time. And again, as with the other episodes, there is a blog post on our website which kind of gives some more detail and is related to the things that we're doing here. And you can see the link there on the screen. Thank you for your time and have a good day.